The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
If you've wondered where the Lions are or waited for a miracle, we've got something special tonight. As Canadian folk icon Bruce Cockburn prepares for the Ontario leg of his current tour, we speak to him about a life in music and activism. Then our Ontario Hub's report on reaction to the Pope's apology to Indigenous people. And from what Wastewater shows about a sixth wave of COVID-19 to lessons for policing from the Ottawa convoy, we've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, April 8th, and that's all ahead on the agenda. Five decades of making music and writing songs that find new fans in successive generations is a rare feat. Bruce Cockburn's voice has been amongst the most forceful and distinctive in Canadian folk, pop, and spiritual music. His works are a roadmap to some of the pressing issues of the past half-century, from war and injustice to environmentalism. And after 13 Junos and countless other awards, he's just issued a greatest hits collection and set out on tour once more. Joining us now from San Francisco, California, Bruce Cockburn. Welcome back.
Thanks. Great to be back with you.
I'm so happy to meet you, even though it's virtually. You're about 2/3 of the way through a massive Canada-US tour, and you're about to kick off a tour in the province of Ontario. You've been in this business for 5 decades and have done many tours against many backdrops. What's it been like to tour during a time like this?
It's been interesting because, I mean, like everybody else, I had to wait 2 years to get this done. And I mean, this tour was supposed to happen in 2020, which was the actual 50th anniversary of the release of my first album. Mm-hmm. And we had a lot of shows planned, a more extensive tour than this one actually planned for that year. But obviously it didn't happen. So here we are. And what I'm finding in this, with the shows that I've done so far, is that people are very excited to be out. And it sort of almost doesn't matter who's on stage or what they're doing. It's just like, look at us all together in a room at once, you know, without freaking out. It's like, you know, it feels like we're all getting away with something.
And I think maybe it's reminding us of the things that we've taken for granted before, right?
I would say, yeah. I mean, I think the whole 2 years was time to sort of meditate on that notion. Because every time you turn around, there was something else that wasn't quite happening the way you were used to. So, you know, here we are now in a kind of a modified reality, you know, that I think is going to continue to modify itself over the next period of time. And so, you know, we will continue to be asked to be.
I imagine too that, you know, during that time, we've heard lots of stories of people learning how to bake during the past 2 years, learning a new language. But I imagine that in the past 2 years, you've been writing and making and composing new music. How did the pandemic inspire the new music you're composing now?
I have about almost enough songs to do a new album. We're thinking about recording in the fall. So yes, the songwriting has carried on. It's not at any more accelerated a pace than it would have during any other 2-year period, I don't think, but it's there, it's happening. And there are a couple of the songs that are directly a result of what we've been living with. One of the things, not just COVID, but the living in the U.S. as I am, we're confronted daily with this incredible level of fractiousness on the part of the population. And it's like the things that used to be just descriptions or ways of identifying yourself have now become pejorative. Like words like liberal. You know, liberal now means in some circles that you're a supporter of pedophiles or something. You know, I mean, it's not literally, of course, but this is a rhetoric that's going around, and that isn't just a result of COVID, although I think it was exaggerated by the shutdown and all the different tensions that have been kind of fostered by people feeling that they were confronted with something threatening and the sense of being confined. I think those elements have conspired to aggravate something that the Trump administration also kind of deliberately aggravated. That was already there. It's not new, but the what used to be things that we tended to want to overlook or sidestep in order to get along with each other have now become reasons to hate each other. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a real bad thing. And I don't know where that's going to go. I don't think it's going to blow over quickly, but hopefully we can get past it.
Yeah, there's been this feeling of, I even have friends that I've known for a very long time that live in the States, and there just seems to be, it seems as if people are quick to misunderstand each other. And you mentioned the word liberal. You're a Christian. Nowadays, too, if you say you're a Christian, it seems to kind of imply other things. How have you received that?
That's not new either, really. I mean, there was a period, I remember talking with T-Bone Burnett, who produced a couple of albums for me in the early 90s about this. He is also, at least was then, a Christian. I don't know what his status is now, but I assume so. But he said, it might be time for Christians to just stop calling themselves Christians, because we were all tired of having to explain that we're Christian, but we're not one of those. And we're back to that again. I mean, for a while it was not an issue, mm-hmm. and now it is again. So it's unfortunate that that people have to bring God into these very mundane and kind of petty things. I mean, the effects are not petty; the effects are profound and serious. But the attitudes and the feelings and all that sort of stuff that are feeding this are petty. And so I mean, I don't think abortion's mentioned in the Bible at all, for instance, right? It might be. I might have missed something in there somewhere in the Old Testament, but it seems to me that there's a more than ready willingness on the part of numerous biblical figures of all persuasions in the early parts of the Bible to sacrifice their firstborn, and it was the done thing back then. I mean, so it's and there's just so much confusion around all this stuff, and that confusion is manipulated by people with an interest in doing so, whether for political reasons or reasons of just personal power in the case of certain pastors and that kind of thing. But it's tainted, and it really has nothing. The idea that America is a Christian nation is completely counter to the American Constitution, for one thing, mm-hmm. which it talks about. The framers of the Constitution talked about God, but they were Masons. I mean, they weren't necessarily Christian, and the lengths they went to separate church and state were radical at the time and really worthwhile.
Well, speaking of radical, not to interrupt you, but speaking of radical, you've been called radical in your music. It's interesting because I find that a lot of your fans, I think we're all trying to find the meaning of life. And one of your songs, one of my favorite quotes, my favorite lyrics from you is from Lovers in a Dangerous Time. And you say, but nothing worth having comes without some kind of fight. Got to kick at the darkness till it bleeds daylight. And I think it's kind of speaks so much of what's going on. And you've also been vocal on several issues throughout your career, environmentalism in particular. We have a short clip from If a Tree Falls in the Forest, and then we'll continue our conversation. Sheldon, please roll.
Climate Control Center for the World. Ancient cord coexistence hacked by parasitic greedhead scam. From Sarawak to Amazonas, Costa Rica to mangy BC hills, Cortez rhythm of falling timber. What kind of currency grows in these new deserts, these brand new floodplains. If a tree falls in the forest, does anybody hear?
It feels kind of heartbreaking that, that song was released in 1988, 34 years ago. The planet wasn't experiencing the pace of of change that we are right now. You see what is happening around the world and the climate crisis, and you think what, Bruce?
It's depressing and worrisome. I mean, not for me. I'm going to be dead before the real stuff hits the fan. But my daughter, my younger daughter, especially, and my grandchildren, are going to be living with a much worse situation than we're currently dealing with, and I hate that idea. And I don't know how avoidable it was. It's not avoidable now. I don't think. I think we missed the boat. I think we can probably still have the chance to mitigate it somewhat, but it's happening, and the thing is. Yeah, 34 years ago when that song came out, it wasn't news then either. It was like, I mean, I got that from somewhere. I didn't go out and do the research myself and discover it. People were warning about this stuff back in the 60s and early 70s, and nobody did anything. That's not true. It's not true to say that nobody did anything, but the people who acted and the people who addressed the issue as best they could were not the people in a position to really make major changes, and therefore the changes have not happened.
There is so much going on in the world right now: the climate crisis, the pandemic, many wars, the Russian invasion in Ukraine. One of your most popular songs, "If I Had a Rocket Launcher," was inspired by a trip to a refugee camp. What impact did that experience have on you?
It was profoundly moving and a major kind of wake-up moment for me. We'd all seen refugee camps on TV, and we'd seen the ads, and there's Sally Field out there crying and telling you that you need to send money for these poor little kids. But we could understand that the need was there, but to be in the presence of people in that situation. Where it comes off a screen and becomes fully fleshed, as it were, is a whole other thing, because you can have people. It's not worthless to put this stuff on a screen, but it's not the same as with from every other social interaction we have. And it's different when you're talking to somebody face to face, and there's a smell about it. There are feelings that don't come through very well by technological means. And there's a sense. I mean, in the case of this particular experience, I was in two different camps inhabited by refugees from Guatemala. They had fled horrendous repression and persecution in Guatemala. Mm-hmm. Just vile, brutal stuff. And they had maintained, in very desperate straits, with no food and no prospects and all that, they had maintained a really great social cohesiveness and a sense of dignity that was unexpected. They were desperate, but you wouldn't know that from from the way they carried themselves.
Well, I lived in a refugee camp, and I think it's very different when people, because sometimes people hear that there's a little bit of like pity, but when you live in those camps, you're living your life as you know it with your family, and you're living life and you're experiencing life. I just wanted to quote a lyric from "If I Had a Rocket Launcher." The lyrics: "How many kids they have murdered? If I had a rocket launcher, I'd make somebody pay." We're seeing the Russian invasion on Ukraine. And I think people are kind of feeling like this, this feeling of hopelessness, helplessness. How can we get past this need to wage wars and humans' capacity for self-destruction?
Well, it's a very large question, and one that people have wrestled with as long as we've been on the planet, I think, because the tendency to brutalize each other has been with us since we've been on the planet, and I don't think it's going away. I happen to have grown up in a part of the world and in an era when there was no war. I mean, we had wars everywhere else. Canadians and Americans both were involved in wars all over the place. But on our own turf, no. And so, that's an aberration historically. I don't think there have been very many other periods in history where you can have a whole generation that can say that. But having traveled as I have and visited the conflict zones that I have, I came to feel that war is actually a default condition of humankind. I think that the challenge that we face is to rein in a tendency that we will never get rid of, that may be a product of the fact that, as a fledgling species thousands of years ago, we were, or even 500,000 years ago, whatever, we experienced being both predator and prey. And so we act like both. If you watch horses, they act like prey animals. They're fearful of things in the way that they are, and they're blustery in the way they are, and so on. And we see that, parallel mammalian behavior in people too. But at the same time, we also have the predator side, that where we kill things for a living, basically. And so, how do you reconcile those? They both of those mammalian, elements, let's say, carry with them complicated, psychologies and sets of feelings and so on. Mm-hmm. And we've never really come to grips with that dichotomy there. So until we do, we're going to be swept in one direction or the other, depending on whether we're angry or afraid, or whether it's fight or flight and so on. And I mean, we complicate things because we are the most complicated mammals that we know of, and so.
Well, your music has played a. Because looking back, and music has a history of having an impact on world issues. And your music, they've been called protest songs. What impact do you think your music has had on your fans' activism? Maybe a way to counter all this rage and uncertainty we have around the world.
Well, the hope is by offering something that by paying attention to these things and kind of looking them in the eye and addressing them, that we can actually do something about it and refrain from the excesses of that kind of activity. So with songs, I mean, I don't think songs really change anything, but what they do is if there's a body of popular sentiment out there, the songs can resonate with that and become a kind of rallying point, perhaps, for the feelings that are out there. So in my own case, the stuff I wrote about Central America did have an effect on people. I hear it all the time from people who said, "Oh yeah, your songs inspired me to go to Nicaragua and pick coffee, or to get involved in solidarity work, or whatever." And I didn't expect that when I put the songs out. I just wanted to communicate what I thought was true with my peers, basically. But it had that effect on people. And other songs I hear about that have had more of the feedback has been personal that I've heard, but and not so much around political issues. But the capacities out there. I mean, there are songs. "We Shall Overcome" became an anthem of the civil rights movement in the 60s because people could sing it, because it's a powerful song to begin with, and it touched how people felt and wanted to feel. So if a song does that, then it might have a place in the process. I mean, there's another whole thing though. Sadly, all these years later, we're still dealing with friggin' civil rights. Like, who would have guessed? 50 years later, 60, 70 years later. I mean, it's like, perplexed by that.
I'm also perplexed, and I think there's so many things that are, as I mentioned, so many things are happening around the world, and people trying to make sense of them. You're a devout Christian, and you recently returned to church after not going to church for about 40 years, I think. You've said, and you've also said that in the past that your songs come from God. What was it? What did it feel like for you to go back to a physical church?
I wonder if I can remember now. I haven't done it now. It's been a couple of years.
Well, before the pandemic, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Church became virtual, and that's what I've been doing. But
yeah.
but really, for me, it was a what, I'm just trying to think of the best way to say this. That at various points in my life, there have been indicators that, okay, a page is turning. It's time for this new thing to happen. So I drifted away from going to church long ago because partly because of circumstances changing in my exterior life, and partly because it was part of a journey to become more deeply involved with people socially and less cerebral about things, and this all, it worked out that way. So all these years later, my wife started, she got herself involved in a very deep exploration of spiritual things because of the death of a friend of ours, tragic death that happened a few years ago. And in the process, started going to this particular church. And she was saying, it's really great. You got to come. You're going to really like it. And I'm going, I'm not a church going anymore. I don't think so. And I resisted for a long time until I finally went, caved, and I walked through the door to this place. It's a little church, small congregation, but there was this wall of love. Mm. The minute I walked in the door, it was like a palpable thing. And, okay, good. And the music was good. And the pastor spoke very well and was very well informed and erudite in his talk. And so I thought, well, I gotta pay attention to this. And I started going. And I very quickly realized that page had turned. It was time for me to be back among people who identify as Christians again.
When I used to go to church, I was in the church choir, although my voice is best kept in closed doors, behind closed doors, my closed doors. Do you sing in the choir? Do you participate in the choir?
I played in the band.
Yeah.
This is it's a non-denominational church, but it's got kind of Pentecostal leanings here and there, and so it's the kind of church that doesn't have a choir; it has a band. And I ended up. They didn't know who I was. I was just this old guy walked in, with an attractive younger woman, and okay, we'll put up with you. And they were all very friendly and everything and welcome, but nobody knew anything about me. And it turned out I played guitar. Oh, great! Well, the band needs a guitar player if you want to come and sit in. So I came and sat in, and it became a regular thing.
That's amazing.
And it was fun for me because I got to play electric guitar and I got to play somebody else's music, and I enjoyed it a lot, actually, and I missed that part of it over these last 2 virtual years.
We only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to get at least one more question in. You wrote and performed the theme song for the kids' animated TV series Franklin, who is a turtle, very popular in my house. We have a clip to show. Sheldon, please roll.
Hey, it's Franklin, coming over to play. Growing a little every day. Here he comes with all his friends. They've got stories, got time to spend with you.
Obviously, that song is a song that appeals to children and draws children in. When you're a child, you're still learning, and you have a young daughter as well. Looking back on a career that spans 5 decades and nearly 40 albums, what would you tell your younger self?
Don't worry so much. That'd be the main message. I used to worry about a lot of stuff I didn't really have to worry about. But doing things like the Franklin theme were ways of countering that in a way. I mean, I wasn't, that was long after I'd started. I mean, that was in the 90s, you know, I worried about public perception of me and how it would affect me as a person in ways that I probably didn't have to worry about, because it was all in my imagination. It was like, what if this happens, what if that happens? Over the years, you learn to kind of let the what ifs slide because you don't have that kind of control anyway.
And I think a lot of us need to hear that, not to worry so much. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you. I wish we had more time. Best of luck on the tour and all the best in anything that you're doing. We love you here on the show and are really grateful that you had some time for us tonight. Thank you so much, Bruce.
Thanks for having me. It's been great to talk with you.
A historic series of meetings took place in the past week at the Vatican with Indigenous leaders. Those culminated with Pope Francis apologizing for what he acknowledged were deplorable abuses suffered in Catholic-run residential schools in Canada. Charnel Anderson, who covers the Northwest for Ontario Hubs, spoke to members of the delegation, and she joins us now on that. Hi, Charnel.
Hi, Dan.
All right, so let's take a step back and talk about how did this trip actually come about?
So this trip has been in the works for a few years, but like a lot of things, it was put on hold because of the pandemic. So it was originally planned for December of last year, but the Omicron wave was surging at that time. So it was rescheduled for the end of March. However, the request for an apology from the Pope for the Catholic Church's role in residential schools goes back even further. In 2009, Phil Fontaine, who was then head of the AFN, he traveled to the Vatican with a small delegation at the request of Pope Benedict. And that's who they met with and who acknowledged the suffering of residential school survivors and expressed sorrow, but Pope Benedict didn't outright apologize. And so this call for an apology was later sort of enshrined in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action in 2015. But it sort of languished for a while until 2017 when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau went to the Vatican to meet with Pope Francis. And at that time, he requested an apology. And Trudeau said that he seemed open to the idea, but again, it sort of fell by the wayside until last year, June 2021, shortly after hundreds of unmarked graves were discovered near the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, which was run by the Catholic Church for almost 80 years. And so that discovery led to renewed calls for the Catholic Church to release the documents they have related to residential schools. And it put more scrutiny on the fact that the church did not fulfill its promises to compensate residential school survivors under the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. And it ultimately led the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops to start planning this trip in earnest, which finally happened last week.
All right, I want to talk about the delegation, more importantly, the person who led it. You spoke to Cassidy Caron, president of the Métis National Council. What was her reaction when she found out that she would lead the delegation to Vatican City?
So Cassidy is actually the first woman elected head of the Métis National Council. That happened last October. And very soon after that, she learned that she would be leading the Métis delegation to the Vatican. And at this point, again, the trip was scheduled for December. So she didn't have a lot of time to really get their delegation together and start planning for what they want to get out of this trip. But so she got the Métis National Council's board of directors together, and they decided kind of how they want to select their delegates. And they decided that the ultimate goal of this trip was really to elevate the voices of Métis residential school survivors.
You had mentioned, previous trips, of course, by Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. I'm just curious, did she have any particular expectations with this trip going into it?
Yeah, so initially, the Métis National Council planned to go to Rome to invite the Pope to Canada to apologize on Indigenous land, which would fulfill the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action number 58, which I should point out was issued in 2015. And part of call to action number 58 was that it would be fulfilled within 1 year. It's been about 7 years. But in October, the Vatican announced that Pope Francis had agreed to come to Canada to meet with Indigenous leaders. So at that point, Cassidy says that the Métis National Council shifted gears and decided that this trip would be about getting the Pope to listen to their stories, particularly the experiences of Métis residential school survivors. And so in preparing for this trip, Cassie told me that she met with a lot of survivors and elders in an effort to devise the best gift to give the Pope. And the survivors and the elders told her that the best gift, the greatest gift that they could bring was their stories and their truth. And so that kind of became the goal for this trip, to share those stories. So when Pope Francis does ultimately come to Canada, he has a greater awareness, a better understanding of the effects of the residential school system and intergenerational trauma.
All right, I want to show a photo of Cassidy Caron and the delegation here, which of course is made up of Métis First Nations and Inuit representatives. You can see the Pope is in the center, and then Cassidy is actually the fourth person to the right of the Pope. What did she have to say about her personal interactions with the Pope?
So Cassidy really shared her experience from the perspective of observing the interactions between the Métis residential school survivors and the elders and the Pope. And the survivors and the elders shared their stories with the Pope, who I understand listened intently. And Cassidy said that the Pope really seemed struck by the stories that he was hearing. And so after they shared their stories, Cassidy delivered her message on behalf of the Métis National Council, which she described as inviting the Pope on a journey of truth, healing, reconciliation, and justice. And during this time, they also had the opportunity to share gifts with Pope Francis. And so the gifts they gave include a pair of red moccasins with traditional Métis beadwork, which were made by Mitch Case, who is one of the Métis delegates. And they also gave the Pope a Métis sash, which was made into a stole, which is what the popes wear around their shoulders, which was a gift from the Métis Nation of Alberta. And then they also gave the Pope a book, which was full of stories from other Métis residential school survivors who couldn't attend. And along with the book was a letter, which kind of outlined actions that the Church and the Pope can take on this journey of truth, healing, reconciliation, and justice.
As you mentioned, of course, what came out of that was an apology in Vatican City. I want to pull up a clip that looks at that apology.
For the deplorable conduct of these members of the Catholic Church,
E vorrei dirvi di tutto cuore, sono molto addolorato. E mi unisco ai fratelli vescovi canadesi.
I ask for God's forgiveness, and I want to say to you with all my heart, I am very sorry, and I join my brothers, the Canadian bishops, in asking your pardon.
As you mentioned, this apology was a Truth and Reconciliation recommendation. What was the former chair of the TRC, Mary Sinclair's reaction to that clip?
So after the apology, Marie Sinclair, who, as you say, was a chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from 2009 to 2015, he spoke about the issue of those who deny the harms of the residential school system. As APTN reported, Marie said, quote, "Denialism was allowed to flourish because of the silence that was coming from the Pope. With this statement, those denying within the Church or denying in public because of the Church being able to support denialism will no longer have that ladder upon which they can stand." End quote. And so this is something that that was important to Cassidy as well. The Métis National Council are calling on the Church to consider making it a crime within canon law to deny or diminish the malicious intent behind the abuse and trauma that occurred as a result of the residential school system. And, we saw some of this denialism even following reports of unmarked graves last year. Some people tried to deny the evidence that there are graves at these former schools. But now the Pope has acknowledged the harms of the residential school system. And as Marie said, those denying the harms will no longer have that ladder upon which they can stand.
I want to get Cassidy's take on that apology as well. She was there in person. Did it make a difference?
So Cassie told me that it really wasn't about her or how she felt personally about the apology. What mattered to her was really the reaction from the residential school survivors that she was with as the apology was being read. And, so she was sitting in that room and she said that you could really feel and hear and see their reaction. She said that it changed their lives. But Cassie also acknowledged that the Pope's words mean different things to different people, depending on where they're coming from and where they're at on their healing journey. From what I can tell, talking to other people and reading stories and comments online, the reception of the apology overall has really been mixed. There's people who feel that it's meaningless without concrete action. Some people say it's too little, too late. And some people accept the apology but wished it would have happened on Indigenous land. But for other people, it really was a significant moment. This is the head of the Catholic Church acknowledging the harms perpetrated by some of its members. And I think for some people that acknowledgement may validate what they knew all along, but it really allows them to move forward on their healing journey, possibly towards forgiveness and a less complicated relationship with the Catholic Church, with perhaps the caveat that these words are turned into action.
As you mentioned, Pope Francis making an apology on Indigenous lands is seen as the two-part in this apology and the most important part. He said he would travel to Canada. Is this seen by Indigenous people as a positive prospect?
So yeah, it sounds like the Pope is going to come to Canada, and it's not entirely clear when that will be. He said not in the winter time, but it could be sometime this summer. Some are saying even the end of July, during the Feast of St. Anne, which the Church celebrates on July 26th. But that's yet to be confirmed by the Vatican. Regardless of when it happens, though, I think at that time, people will be looking for another apology on Indigenous land, for those who weren't able to make it to the Vatican. And that would fulfill the TRC's call to action number 58, an apology from the Pope in Canada. And I think that would be really meaningful for a lot of people. But, as I say, a lot of the details have yet to be confirmed. We don't know whether there will be another apology, but I do know that it's already a highly anticipated visit.
Charnel, really appreciated. Great insights. Thank you so much for this important story.
Thanks, Jan.
The agenda this week looked for insights on the future of policing after the Ottawa convoy, asked if municipal politicians needed greater oversight, and learned why the war in Ukraine means trouble for global food security. The agenda's Week in Review begins with what wastewater signals suggest about a sixth wave of COVID-19.
It's been really a spectrum. There's been some public health units that have been extremely supportive of this and progressive and have looked at the data and said, we're going to use it for what it's worth and just use it as a complementary tool to all the other information we've had. While other public health units, and understandably so, have looked at the data and said, well, there's no real provincial guidelines, there's no real kind of script for us to follow in terms of how to really interpret this data. And that's completely understandable. So you see a spectrum across the province, and possibly at this point, we alluded to this and talked about it, without the real kind of same critical mass of clinical data that we're able to see. I think the wastewater now is being more and more positioned as an important metric for us to really understand what's happening in our communities.
Claire, let me ask you about that. Yeah, Robert says it's understandable that some public health units want to sort of be stingy with that information, but do you think it's understandable that they're not as open as they perhaps could be or should be?
I think that, wastewater surveillance data is, it's tricky data to work with. It can be variable from day to day, and that's just, I think, the nature of how the samples are collected in the analyses. And I think that, like Dr. De La Tolla alluded to, like very close relationships and communications between the research teams that are doing the analysis and the public health units is critical for interpreting the data and to see through some of that variability. Well, so I can understand if those relationships don't get formed early on, then there could maybe be some trouble, fully using the data for a specific public health unit. But in our experience in the city of Toronto, we've had like an excellent relationship with Toronto Public Health, and we really work with them as a cohesive unit to interpret the data that our lab is putting out.
Why do you think they've chosen to be particularly forthcoming when others have not been?
I think that they see the value in the data. They see the value of it as a complementary tool. In the city of Toronto in particular, and the data that's come out of our lab, we sample a lot of facilities as well, such as long-term care homes and homeless shelters. And I know that they've found that data very valuable. We've been able to catch outbreaks just before the clinical testing did. So, the value at that scale became very clear to the public health unit early on.
Gustavo, let me follow up with you in this regard. More and more businesses across Ontario are now opening up, of course, and I wonder whether you are concerned that those businesses that do reopen more, with the potential for more information coming from them, will that somehow skew the data across the province? What's your view on that?
Well, you remember that this is a statistical problem at the end. I think we can modify our parameters in order to take in account this new situation.
And Claire, are there other sort of tricky things that you've got to be watching for as we sort of reopen the province more and more day by day?
Well, I think that maybe what your question alludes to is the fact that people are becoming more and more mobile, and their contribution to the wastewater samples that we're collecting may be coming from different places. And so that might be something that we need to take into consideration if we're trying to assign a certain level or trend to a specific area. And there is mobility data that you can use to understand how mobile a certain population that you're sampling is, and whether or not there's potential that they're contributing to the sample outside of their home area.
Got it. Robert, is it expensive to do this?
When you're comparing the cost associated with wastewater surveillance versus, clinically testing like we did throughout the pandemic, a large number of people in a population base, it's really, really not. I think that's one of the benefits of wastewater surveillance. And an example is Ottawa's 1 million people. Throughout the pandemic, 500 to 4,000 people were tested daily here in order to understand prevalence and incidence of the disease. We collected 1 wastewater sample every day. And not to say that the metrics were equivalent, but that wastewater sample also gave us an indication of whether, there was spread, transmissibility within the province. So cost effectiveness, the economic aspect is a benefit of wastewater surveillance.
This has happened many, many times before. There's been a protest, there's been convoys before. They've come to town, they've done their protest, and then they've left. And that was the expectation, I think, for the most part, as to what was going to happen this time. I personally got a sense of a huge shift that occurred, and I would agree. I don't think the individual officers' actions were nearly as important as some people would like to make it out. What I saw is a really ground swelling shift was when the money, the millions of dollars started rolling in through the GoFundMe, the Give, Send, Go, and then ultimately Bitcoin. Protesters that would otherwise have been expected to leave town suddenly were offered financial assistance to stay in town. They didn't have to worry about paying tickets. They didn't have to worry about buying gas for their vehicles. They didn't have to worry about accommodation, and they didn't have to worry about losing their trucks if the trucks were seized. It changed, in my view, the relationship between the police and the demonstrators and the city. And I know that as a board, one of the questions I asked is, and one of the things I never understood, is why were trucks allowed to re-enter the city after they had left the demonstration? And then we saw trucks that were re-entering. And that made no sense to me. And that was one of the questions. As a board, our role is to ask questions, to have a robust mechanism to ask questions. And we asked, why are these trucks being allowed to re-enter? And the answer we were given was that the protesters had a charter right to bring their vehicles downtown. That made no sense to me. But this, in part, is part of the difficulty the board has. We don't have the resources to challenge the powers that be, the chief, the senior executive. These are the knowledgeable people. They have their legal counsel present. The city's legal counsel is present. So when we're given an answer like that as a board, we don't have the ability to challenge it. But it didn't make sense. And I think it was something that allowed the protest to go on longer. But in addition, there were other issues.
Well, hang on. Don't get to the other issues yet, because we've got a lawyer here, and I want to pursue that idea of they had a charter right to protest, to assemble, to have those trucks in the shadow of Parliament Hill. Okay, Karima, you're a lawyer. Does that make sense to you?
that does not make sense to me. There is, of course, charter rights that protect political expression, the right to assembly, so on and so forth. But there's nothing specifically that allows for the use of commercial vehicles as a tool of protest, especially where there is ample evidence that these vehicles were detrimental, whether it was through the honking, through the idling and the noise pollution, the fumes coming out. The charter is right there in Section 1. There are limits that can be imposed.
No, there are limits,
that's something that would be litigated after the fact. But I don't see that using a truck is something that the charter protects.
No, I appreciate that there are limits on all of our fundamental freedoms in this country. Having said that, it's right there in black and white in the charter. We do have the freedom to assemble. And that's what they were doing. They were assembling. Now, obviously, they had trucks, they had horns, et cetera, et cetera. Could they reasonably conclude that they were in compliance with the charter?
I believe that many thought that they were in compliance with the charter, and the way that it was enforced gave them reason to think that. But the logistics of this type of operation, preventing the actual trucks, does not mean that you're preventing an individual from protesting. And so the truck and the person are not inseparable.
John, just because your metaphors are so fantastic, I want to put a follow-up question to you, if I can here. And that is, it does focus on the Ottawa example and Councillor Chiarelli, who has gotten himself into a great deal of trouble over the last years. And apparently all council could do was dock his pay for 15 months. Do you think we need a change in procedures in Ontario whereby if somebody behaves egregiously, his or her colleagues can say, you know what, we're impeaching you and we're kicking you out of your seat because you've gone beyond the pale? What's your view on that?
Well, that's a really tough one because you see such terrible behavior in some municipalities that you say, hey, that should be the result. The problem with that is, Steve, is that most places, most assemblies do not allow their own members to kick out a fellow member because that would be the tyranny of the majority, right? They'd be perhaps not liking the maverick views of a particular member of whether it's the council or the assembly, and all of a sudden feel that it's appropriate for them to remove them. Now, the province is looking at things like this. There was a huge consultation commenced last year by the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing to look at what to do with members. Alberta passed recall legislation, not only for local members, but also for members of the Legislative Assembly and for school boards. So there are at play certain initiatives to bring forward greater penalties. But your point is well taken. There's only 2 penalties that are authorized under the Municipal Act for a breach of a code of conduct. One is a reprimand, which is a slap on the wrist. We don't think you're doing very well. We're going to denounce that. And the other one is a suspension of pay for up to 90 days. Of course, Rick Chiarelli had 5 separate instances. So 5. Thank you, Joanne. There was 5 separate instances. So 90 times 5 is 450 days, which is over a year of free work by this council member, which some members would say, hey, he shouldn't be there at all. I think I agree with them.
I want Joanne to pick up on that, if you would. How much appetite was there on council? And we should stress, Councillor Chiarelli defends his innocence in all of these matters, but how much appetite was there among his fellow councillors to have him thrown off council altogether, even though that wasn't an option?
After the second report came out, the Integrity Commissioner brought it forward and council voted on it. They immediately and unanimously passed a motion asking him to resign. Minister Stephen Clark, he is the Minister of the Municipal Affairs and Housing, personally also asked him to resign, which is unheard of. And of course, he has said no. He is still on council. He's getting his pay again as of late last year. But, even while he was being unpaid, he was a counselor, he was collecting his pension. And it is amazing. Every time I talk about this story, we've done a lot of coverage of this here at CBC. I'm on the air. I get letters all the time asking, well, why is he still here? When is he leaving? And it was interesting. The public was just not aware that there's no mechanism for removing someone from office. And it's pretty interesting because there are mechanisms if you breach a financial rule. For example, there was the case of Jim Carriganis in Toronto, spent too much money on his celebration party after the 2018 election. He broke some financing rules, and he is literally no longer a councillor, but someone who has broken behavioral rules, codes of conduct to a quite shocking degree. There's really no way to remove them from their elected seats, and people were shocked by that. There's a huge move in Ottawa to change the rules.
I'm going to start our discussion just by reading an excerpt from the New York Times, this from last week, and it goes like this. For the global food market, there are few worse countries to be in conflict than Russia and Ukraine. Over the past 5 years, they have together accounted for nearly 30% of the exports of the world's wheat, 17% of corn, 32% of barley, a crucial source of animal feed, and 75% of sunflower seed oil, an important cooking oil in some parts of the world. David M. Beasley, the executive director of the United Nations World Food Program, said Ukraine has only compounded a catastrophe on top of a catastrophe. There is no precedent even close to this since World War II. Earthren, I wonder, having heard what David Beasley had to say about this, I wonder how you would characterize the pressure now being felt on the global food supply.
David's absolutely right. This is a looming, as the Secretary General has said, hurricane on the horizon. I was serving as the U.S. Ambassador for Food and Agriculture in the aftermath of the 2007-8 food crisis and during the 2011 high food price hunger crisis. And what we saw then was that was when hunger spiked around the world to about 1 billion people. And we know that today, as we are speaking, there are 811 million people who are food insecure. And that number increased by about almost 100 million as a result of COVID. And there's an expectation that this situation, and this is just a tipping point of challenges that had already begun because of lack of fertilizer, high gas prices, the spike in wheat futures. And then you have this availability challenge that results from the lack of export from Russia and Ukraine. And so that number of 811 billion, some are speculating, could again increase to over 1 billion people. And the number of those who are critically, acutely hungry could increase from the 276 million today to another 100 to 150 to over 350 million people who are acutely hungry. And that means without assistance, there will be famines.
Evan, you just heard me read that quote from David Beasley from the UN World Food Program saying this was a catastrophe on top of a catastrophe. Is that being overly dramatic?
No, I mean, I agree with Ambassador Cousin here. I mean, and the head of the World Food Program. Any one of the problems that Ambassador Cousin just listed on their own wouldn't necessarily trigger a global crisis. But when you've already got high food price inflation, supply chain bottlenecks, low food stocks. This is another thing. The United Nations tracks something called the supply to use ratio, which basically is a fancy way of saying how much food we've got versus how much we use. And the supply to use ratio is at its lowest point since I think 2015 or 2016. So you put all of these things together and you do have layers of catastrophe and a cascading ripple effect that means that when you take Russia and Ukraine, which are in amongst the world's top 5 wheat exporters, out of the equation for this year, wheat importing countries such as Egypt and North Africa, the Middle East, will be in desperately troubled situations, and then the looming specter of famine and skyrocketing hunger around the planet. It's a terrifying moment.
Lenore Newman, if you're a farmer in Ukraine right now, you obviously can't do what you want to do when there are bombs dropping all around you. So what's not happening right now that should be happening?
Yes, well, obviously in Ukraine, we are seeing total disruption of the farming cycle for the most part. It's a long-held historic truth that war is particularly hard on farmers. But I think I have to stress, as my colleagues mentioned, it's the waves of disruption flowing out from that are particularly damaging. And I don't know that we've entirely mentioned yet the disruption of fertilizer flow from Russia and Ukraine is also critical, and that's impacting South America and Africa and well, the entire world as well. And as it has been mentioned as well, it's on top of 3 years of basic constant disruption, climate change, pandemic. And I'm usually an optimist, and I usually say, well, one-off situation, the food system is really good at being resilient. This time, it's there's fatigue. There's disaster fatigue, one could say.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's all for this Friday, April 8th, 2022. Monday on the program is Canada entering a new era of defense spending. We'll consider that. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, and Steve will see you on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.